So this is something just a little bit different for the channel, and you can see I'm taking it seriously because I've even got my suit on to discuss it. Um, as YouTube has become increasingly demonetized in recent months, I've been on Patreon for a while, but I've started pushing it a little bit more. And one of my current Patreon subscribers has put in for a request video for me to discuss Mike Tyson at his peak versus the current crop of modern day heavyweights. So I want to give a big shout out to Firaz, both for requesting the video and for signing up on Patreon. Um, Hopefully there'll be future work of this nature. You know, there's another request video that has come through that I'm going to look at later on in the week, and I know Firaz, who's made this request, is hopeful that we'll do a bit more of a series along this line of looking back at some of the fighters from days gone by and discussing them against other opponents. So, hopefully it's something that we can do a bit more often on the channel moving forward. But in this video, we're going to discuss Mike Tyson versus the modern day crop, and we're defining the modern day crop as like a sort of peak Tyson Fury, a peak David Haye, Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder, those sort of names. Now, to begin with, as a disclaimer, I don't consider myself a boxing historian. To be honest, if you ask me to define myself, I'd say I'm a boxing fan who enjoys discussing the sport. I'm not a historian. I wasn't born at the very start of the Tyson era. I arrived onto this planet, somewhere within the early half of the Tyson era, let's say. But clearly, I wasn't at an age where I was necessarily glued to the box, what's in the fights, even that early on. So, when I've sat down to record this request video, I've been rewatching a lot of tape, looking back at some old fights, that sort of thing. Clearly, I wasn't always there at the time, but there you go. I've taken a fresh look, if you like, at the Tyson era. I've probably discussed Mike Tyson on several different occasions on this channel at the past. I'm kind of going to disregard any comments and kind of look at it with a fresh pair of eyes for this video. So, without further ado, let's get into it. How would Mike Tyson at his peak have done against the current crop of heavyweights? Now, I'm going to start by referring to the fact that Mike Tyson has recently been commented upon by a few notable figures in boxing, specific with his relation to the current crop of heavyweights. So Larry Holmes, in comments that were very well publicised, and I think I've written this down as a verbatim quote, said, "Anthony Joshua, he would have knocked out prime Mike Tyson. There's no reckon about it. Mike Tyson went down low and then came up and tried to throw roundhouses, but Joshua would hit him with a straight right hand on the side of his damn chin, and Mike wouldn't get up." So Larry Holmes, very much in favour of the current crop and the likes of AJ being able to take out Mike Tyson, referring to Mike Tyson's small stature and style potentially as disadvantages that wouldn't stand him in good stead in this generation. Deontay Wilder himself has been fairly vocal. I detect that Deontay Wilder and Mike Tyson don't have the best of a relationship for whatever reason, and Wilder was very, very critical of Mike Tyson's resume from different comments that I've read. One could argue that Deontay Wilder probably isn't in the best of positions to be criticising other heavyweights' resumes, given that people in glass houses probably shouldn't throw stones, and Wilder's best win is probably still Bermain Stavern. Now, whatever you think of Mike Tyson's resume, and we'll probably come on to that later in this video, it's certainly clear that he fought stronger heavyweights than Bermain Stavern. But anyway, without further ado, brief thoughts on Mike Tyson. I guess comparing and contrasting him to the current crop, let's start with my thoughts on him as a fighter. So, as we know, youngest heavyweight champ of all time. He became heavyweight champ 20 years old. He had, I think, 15 fights in his first year as a professional. He won his first 19 fights by straight knockout, with 12 of those 19 coming in the first round. Retired with a record of 50 wins and 6 losses, with 44 of the 50 wins coming by way of knockout. So Clearly a big puncher, clearly a lot of guys, clearly a guy who took a lot of people out very, very early, and as we know from watching him, a very, very dangerous fighter. Now, with Mike Tyson, one of the hardest things is to define when his peak was, because the conventional wisdom is that a heavyweight fighter peaks, 30 years old, that sort of age, maybe even a bit older in certain cases. Whereas with Mike Tyson, a lot of the consensus online, depending on who you listen to and what you read, is that Mike Tyson had a very, very early peak, and he was kind of at his peak at the age of 20, 21, 22, 23. Now, there's certain schools of thought that say, in many ways, whilst the form he showed in his early 20s was his peak, it kind of represented a false peak, because, Tyson would have gone on to be a bigger, better heavyweight had he not been led astray in his career, and had he not had so many personal and legal problems outside of the ring. So there is a genuine debate there as to was Tyson at his peak at 21, 22, or is it just that that's the best form we saw of Tyson and he never actually did hit his peak because of problems outside of the ring that prevented him from doing so. From 1980, I think he went pro in 85, and by 1990, at only the age of 24, he was suffering his loss to Buster Douglas. So that's what I'm kind of getting at, that the peak of Tyson's form is actually very, very early on in his career. He took that loss to Buster Douglas over a decade before he fought Lennox Lewis. It's kind of funny looking back at the time frame like that. But before that loss to Buster Douglas, he was already having all sorts of problems. He was having the divorce, which was well publicised. There was the fraught relationship with Don King. There was the death of his trainer and mentor, Costamato. So Tyson, I guess, seemingly slipped from 1990 onwards, most notably being sent to prison, and he served over 3 years in 1992. So he came out of prison in 95. We then saw the 2 fights with Evander Holyfield, both of which ended badly for Mike Tyson. If I'm not mistaken, although I haven't double checked this, there was another slightly shorter spell in prison, and then a few years before the Lennox Lewis fight, and then from there it was kind of downhill, losses to the likes of Danny Williams, Kevin McBride, etc. So my take is that when we look at the best of Mike Tyson, we have to be talking about the period of sort of 1986 through to about 1988. I think that is when we see Tyson achieving the peak of his form, and I actually think that's probably when Tyson looks the most destructive in terms of his in-ring action. So in 1986 he won his first world title, the WBC belt, and that was against Trevor Berbick, and then through to 1987 we saw him unify the title. So the WBO belt wasn't, I'm not even sure if the WBO belt was a generally considered a world title belt back then, or even if it didn't exist. But Tyson considered a unified world champion, having WBC, WBA, IBF. WBO certainly less of a force, if a force even completely. So he was the number one. He was considered the unified title, because in 87 he took out James Bonecrusher Smith and Tony Tucker to have all 3 of those belts. In that period of 86 to 87, maybe into 88, he also beat an aged Larry Holmes. He beat Michael Spinks. Obviously the Frank Bruno fight, the first Frank Bruno fight, which will live long in the memory for fans of British heavyweight boxing. But that's when he was probably at his most devastating. That's when he was winning belts, unifying titles, and was the consensus number one in the division by some way. The times that he started losing, obviously there was the Buster Douglas loss in 1990. Holyfield was, the first fight was 96, the second fight was 97, Lennox Lewis was 2002. When you look back at Tyson from a pure resume perspective, my take is that Mike Tyson doesn't have an all-time great resume. If you look at his biggest wins, Larry Holmes, out of retirement, way past it. Michael Spinks came up from light heavyweight to fight at heavyweight, straight past Larry Holmes. Guys like Trevor Berbick, Bonecrusher Smith, Tony Tucker, Pinkman Thomas, really, really, really good fighters. I don't think those names necessarily fall into the all-time great category from my own research. You may disagree. If you do disagree, leave me a comment in the section below. When Tyson did fight the consensus all-time top 10 great heavyweights, the likes of Lennox Lewis, the likes of Evander Holyfield, he was unsuccessful. Now, clearly, he's past his peak at that stage. You know, my argument is that Mike Tyson at his peak was probably somewhere between 86 and 88. He was fighting these guys, 10 years plus after that. But my take, nevertheless, is that he probably doesn't have the depth of grade A wins to be considered an all-time great heavyweight purely on resume. I mean, he's definitely in the conversation. He's definitely top 15, top 20, that sort of level. And maybe that is an all-time great. Is he right at the top of the list? Is he with the Alis? Is he with the Lennox Lewises? Is he with the Joe Lewises? For me, from a resume perspective, not. However, from an all-time great head-to-head perspective, I think that's a very, very different question. And whilst the Tyson of 86 to 88 didn't necessarily take, or there weren't necessarily the grade A opponents in the division to compete against him, that Tyson was so ferocious, so deadly, so dangerous, that you could make a strong case that from a head-to-head perspective, he certainly does deserve to be right at the top of the head-to-head list. Looking at Tyson from a stylistic perspective, a lot of modern day fighters are compared to Mike Tyson. A lot of modern day fighters. What I find is that anyone with a shorter build, anyone who gets low, anyone who sort of gets low and then explodes up with the sort of bob and weave, left hook, right hook, left hook, uppercut combination, instantly compared to Mike Tyson. But to watch Mike Tyson fight, for me, what he brought to the ring was quite a unique proposition that hasn't actually been matched subsequently. His head movement, his upper body movement, possibly second to none in the context of the heavyweight division. Huge natural strength, speed, athleticism, a real explosive fighter with world-class conditioning at his peak, world-class timing. For me, possibly you could say the ultimate master of that peekaboo defensive style where he would get down low, bob left, bob right, explode up. You see names subsequently, you see people say about Derek Chisora doing peekaboo. Literally pales in comparison if you watch more than a minute of Mike Tyson and more than a minute of Derek Chisora. Good combination puncher, great chin. I know he got knocked out 5 times in his career, but at his peak, Mike Tyson could really take a whack and keep going. He's a fighter who has often been compared to, but for me, there hasn't been anyone who's been able to achieve that style and that technique anywhere near to the same extent that Mike Tyson was able to. Let's talk about potential frailties, and I'm talking about frailties at his peak. Before making this video, I actually rewatched Mike Tyson versus James Tillis. That was an interesting fight, and actually, it was quite fun to watch Tillis fight because he's a bit of a throwback fighter. Dwyer, who's one of my favourite YouTubers, often refers to this as the flat-footed era in terms of heavyweight boxing, and you can kind of see watching guys like James Tillis, Chris Bird, etc. that just how much more mobile, how much more up on their toes, how much more fleet of foot, and how much more smooth these guys were back in like the 80s, 90s, etc. compared to today's heavyweights who tend to be much bigger, much more muscle bound, much stiffer. Tillis caused Tyson a lot of problems in that fight. He was very mobile, he was up on his toes constantly, he danced, he never got tired of that back foot dancing game. He used a jab well, he judged range well. He was able to make Tyson explode in and miss relatively regularly due to his lateral movement. I was impressed with Tillis, and it did show that there was a style out there that could be employed and that could cause Mike Tyson problems. I believe that fight was over 10 rounds, and there was substantial debate that James Tillis actually won that fight at the time, and I can see some argument as to why that would be the case. I think 2 of the judges scored it 6-4 in favour of Mike Tyson. So, that was a close fight. That was a fight that possibly could have gone either way. And James Tillis was coming into that fight having lost 4 of his last 5, and Tillis had been stopped before. Tim Witherspoon stopped Tillis in the first round. So Tyson, even at his peak, was not. I think people watch the highlight reel of Tyson and think of him as this unstoppable force of nature who could blow out any heavyweight in 30 seconds. He was clearly the number one heavyweight at the time, don't get me wrong. But was he unbeatable? I think if you look at the Tillis fight, you can certainly make an argument that there were ways to win rounds off Mike. You know, Tillis was the first guy to take Mike the distance. Maybe that came as a bit of a shock and a surprise to Tyson. I thought Tillis's range, his judgment of range and distance, his movement, caused Mike some real problems. So that was interesting. I also watched the Mitch Green fight. Mitch Green obviously was another guy who took Tyson the distance. But it was then, it was the fight subsequent to that, the Berbick fight, the Tucker fight, the Holmes fight, the Spinks fight, where he fought the guys who at the time were cream of the crop, the guys who were the very, very top heavyweights other than Mike in the division. And throughout all of those fights, not only did he win early, but he also had the guys in trouble very, very early on. I rewatched that Pinklon Thomas fight before making this video, and I think Thomas went 6 rounds with Mike Tyson, but a modern day referee may have called that in the first round today. Thomas was hurt, he was on unsteady legs, he was all over the place, and it was just the ferocity with which Tyson would come forward for these guys. These guys were typically, they weren't big compared to the modern day heavyweights. They weren't built like a Tyson Fury in terms of size and stature, but Mike Tyson, 5'10", 5'11", something like that. These guys were very, very big comparatively, and it was just the way Tyson would rush on them. It was the way that he would transition from the outside to the inside seamlessly. It was the explosion and determination behind his punches that was absolutely meaning these guys didn't know what to deal with him. They were panicking on the back foot. He was timing punches well. The body work with the hooks, the uppercuts coming up in the middle. Absolutely lethal stuff. I think one thing I would say about Tyson's style is it probably wasn't the style for an older man. It's a style where you need impeccable conditioning. It's a style where you need to be moving at the head, moving on the upper body, moving on the waist, fast feet, fast hands. It's a style for a young man. That is not a style that is necessarily going to age very well into your late 30s. It's a style reliant on natural athleticism, reliant on huge conditioning. And I think that's probably why the Tyson fall from grace was as exacerbated as it was. You look at a Bernard Hopkins or a Floyd Mayweather type fighter. These guys fought on to much later ages, and they never lost to the equivalents of like a Danny Williams or a Kevin McBride in their respective divisions. And for me, that's because these guys rely on things like angles and spacing and those sort of elements of the game a lot more than Mike Tyson, who was more of an out and out athlete, a sort of seek and destroy merchant. Don't get me wrong, Mike had huge technique and completely mastered his style, but the style he mastered was very much reliant on swarming, explosiveness, coming in low, speed, etc. And these are things that could potentially be affected, in my opinion, if you look at fighters going into their 30s. And I think that's what happened to Mike Tyson. So, we talk about Mike Tyson's peak and was it a fake peak? I'm not so sure. Certainly, the time in prison, the issues outside the ring with his divorce, with Don King, with his trainer, etc. That's not going to help anyone. Of course it's not. But could we confidently say that he would have continued to improve from 1987, 1988 onwards? I'm not so sure. For me, that was a definite peak for Tyson, and it's unclear whether he would have continued to grow as a fighter a year or two onwards. I think probably by the time we get to 87, 88, we're looking at what I consider to be the complete article in terms of Mike Tyson. So, going back to the question in hand, because we're 20 minutes into this video now, and I haven't really addressed the question whatsoever on how Tyson would do against the modern crop of heavyweights. I felt it was important to set the scene by giving some background opinions and thoughts on my opinion on Tyson in general. Let's go back to addressing that question. How does Tyson do against the modern crop of heavyweights? And do you agree with Larry Holmes' statement that AJ would have made very, very easy work of Mike Tyson and knocked him out? Well, the first thing to say is it is somewhat of an unknown, and one of the unknowns surrounding it is the fact that a lot of our grade A current heavyweights are complete unknowns. AJ is the consensus number one heavyweight. A lot of people say he's a prospect who's a unified champion, and you can kind of see that AJ is so young in his career. He hasn't gone the distance yet. There are frailties that seemingly appear on display, but nobody's ever exposed them by being able to get a win against him. So, just how frail are those frailties, I guess you could ask. Deontay Wilder's the same, undefeated in 38, 39 fights. Devastating streak of knockouts. But there are so many questions about these guys. Do we have any confidence that a guy like Anthony Joshua, a guy like Deontay Wilder would have the defensive capability, would have the inside game to deal with a Mike Tyson at his peak? We can't confidently say that they would, because they haven't proven it in the ring. But at the same time, you could say, how can we say AJ wouldn't have that inside game? Because we've never seen a fighter come in and destroy Anthony Joshua on the inside. So we're dealing in uncertainties here. We're dealing in shades of grey rather than black and white. But from my perspective, looking at the likes of Deontay Wilder, looking at the likes of Anthony Joshua, I would have a major concern as to how they would deal with the pace and ferocity of a guy like Mike Tyson. They'd be much bigger than him. They'd be 6, 7, 8 inches bigger than him. They'd probably weigh, certainly, even Wilder probably weighs 20 pounds more than what I consider to be a peak Tyson. AJ probably weighs 40, 50 pounds more, you could say. So they're much bigger men than Mike Tyson. But would they have what it takes? We talk about Dwyer's flat-footed era. Could you see a guy like AJ able to keep Tyson at distance? Would they have the commitment to the jab? Would they have the speed of their footwork and lateral movement to keep him on the outside, like James Tillis did for spells in their fights? Would they be able to stay out of trouble? Would they be able to hold and close down on the inside? You kind of sense, and I'm talking in terms of sense here, that whilst those guys would potentially pose risk to Tyson from range, when Tyson was able to close down the gap, when Tyson was able to get into the middle and into the inside, that they just wouldn't have the capability defensively and the capability on the inside to stifle his work, to get their own offense off, to defend against the Mike Tyson body attack. For me, guys like AJ, guys like Deontay Wilder, they're vulnerable to the body. They're vulnerable to the inside game. They may be vulnerable to the inside uppercut. They're probably vulnerable to an opponent who gets low, shows angles, shows head movement at the pace and precision that Mike Tyson used to. Maybe one day a Wilder will face a guy with those attributes, and maybe he'll come through it with flying colours. But I'm yet to see that Wilder fight, and based on the tape I have seen, where AJ is slightly ungamely, slightly plodding, and Wilder is slightly ungamely. AJ is slightly stiff. Wilder sometimes looks like he's going back in straight lines, that he's not particularly well coordinated. You just think that a guy like Tyson would be able to close down the ring on them, almost like a Golovkin style. Close down the ring, be a predator in there, stalk your prey, position them, and then unload time and time again with explosive work on the inside. I don't have the confidence to say that those guys would beat Tyson. I really don't. And if you offered me a peak Mike Tyson now against the likes of a Deontay Wilder, against the likes of an Anthony Joshua, I'd be rolling with Mike Tyson at his peak. And I'm talking the 87, 88 Mike Tyson. I really would be. Look, those guys pose a threat to Mike Tyson. Those guys pose a threat to any heavyweight of any time. AJ, Tyson, let's say he's between, 210, 215 pounds at his peak. AJ coming in 255, 260, 6'6", 6'7". Tyson, 70-inch reach, 71-inch reach. AJ is a much bigger man. Tyson at his best had a very, very good chin, but if AJ could catch him consistently from range, clearly AJ does have the power to hurt him, like Larry Holmes suggests. Um, but really, do I see the fight developing like that? No. I see a ferocious battle from the first minute of the first round. I see Tyson throwing caution to the wind, coming in awkwardly, fast, athletic, low, giving all sorts of angles, giving all sorts of head movement, and I just don't have the confidence that the guys like AJ and that the guys like Wilder would have the movement to stop Tyson from closing down the gap, would have the jab to keep him off, would have the inside game and the defence to handle what he offered. That's my take. I pick Tyson over those guys. The other fighters that were mentioned in the question were a peak David Haye and a peak Tyson Fury. Interesting. For me, stylistically, those two are even more intriguing. If I look at that James Tellis, and that's a fight worth watching if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it for, if you're someone who watched it at the time and haven't seen it now for 30 years. That's an interesting fight to have a look back at. When I look at Tillis and when I look at how light on his feet he is, how mobile he is, how smooth he is, the fighter it actually most reminded me of the current crop was the Tyson Fury who beat Vladimir Klitschko. And Fury at his peak, and the Fury peak we'll have to give as the Vladimir Klitschko fight, has certain advantages that Tillis didn't have. For example, as I mentioned, Tillis was coming into that fight with Tyson having lost 4 of his last 5 and having been knocked out. Whereas, obviously, Tyson Fury is a guy who has never been beaten in his career to date. And also, he's a guy who has a very, very, very substantial size advantage over both James Tillis and, of course, Mike Tyson. Tyson Fury pretty much let's not be precise here, but in general terms, Tyson Fury is pretty much a foot taller than Mike Tyson. And that's a very, very, very considerable advantage going into a fight of this nature. Tyson Fury going to have an advantage of 60, 70 pounds. He's going to be, for me, Tyson Fury can potentially move like James Tillis did, but also he can have even increased range, even increased scope to catch Tyson from distance because of how big and how rangy he is. And I also think, obviously, Tyson Fury would struggle with a guy like Mike on the inside. Mike is one of the most outrageous inside fighters the world's ever seen. But Tyson Fury, for me, I'd have much more confidence of him being able to stifle and defend against a guy on the inside than a guy like a Wilder. I know I've already spoken about Derek Chisora being compared to Mike Tyson and that kind of style, but we've seen what Tyson Fury did do with guys like Derek Chisora, who are clearly at a far, far, far lower level than Mike Tyson. But we've seen that Tyson Fury is a guy who can kind of get into the trenches. So I think that's an interesting fight. With Tyson Fury, people question his chin. The fact he's been dropped and got up several times, for me, is a sign of a good chin, not a bad chin. But others persist in the fact he was put down by a cruiserweight means he's got a bad chin. It depends what way you look at it. Clearly, what I would say is that Mike Tyson and his power, those 44 knockouts out of 50 wins, is going to have a threat to any heavyweight in terms of their punch resistance. And Tyson Fury is no different to that. But I do see Tyson Fury potentially enjoying the same success James Tillis did. And I see him enjoying it more, given the fact that he is a lot larger than James Tillis. And fundamentally, if I'm honest, at his peak, I view Tyson Fury as a better fighter than Tillis from the fights that I have seen. David Haye. Now, David Haye is an interesting one because David Haye at his peak in the heavyweight division is a hard man to summarise. Again, it's another fighter we could have a debate as to did he actually ever hit his peak, where was his peak. For me, it's kind of bizarre because looking back on David Haye, I actually think David Haye's best performance was probably the loss to Vladimir Klitschko. Look, you could say the fight against John Ruiz, you could say the fight against Nikolai Valuev, Monty Barrett. Some would even say Derek Chisora. It depends where you draw the line. But I was most impressed by David Haye's performance in defeat against Vladimir Klitschko, despite the fact that he fought an unentertaining fight that didn't keep the fans happy, and despite the fact that he then went and blamed it on a toe injury. But in that fight, David Haye showed electric powers of evasion, fantastic head movement, ridiculous judgment of distance, great back foot game, footwork to the extreme. What he didn't have was enough punching output. He didn't have enough ambition. He didn't have enough aggression. He fought too much in short bursts. He spent the whole fight looking for one KO punch rather than trying to win rounds, and that cost him badly, in my opinion. But that David Haye, who fought that night, is a dangerous, dangerous fighter. He, for me, would be on that night every bit as evasive as a James Tillis, but also carrying the haymaker, that famed one-punch knockout power, and also possibly being a more natural athlete than James Tillis. So I think David Haye at his peak is an interesting fight. However, if I look at David Haye and his... I don't want to say he's got a propensity to being worn down, because I think that's harsh. The fact that he took a loss in the cruiserweight division, on his way up, and people still refer to that, 10, 15 years later. I'm talking about the Carl Thompson loss. But there are other moments where you see that. You look at the Derek Chisora fight, and even though he knocked out Chisora, you kind of sense that was a fight on a knife edge. That was a fight that was maybe turning in the other direction at the time of the stoppage. You just think that a guy like Tyson would catch up with David Haye despite his athleticism, despite his movement, and that David Haye again wouldn't have that inside game, maybe wouldn't have that element of his capability to go the distance against Mike Tyson. So to summarise, Mike Tyson peaked very young, peaked age 21, 22. I'm calling Mike Tyson's peak when he was unifying titles against Burbick, Smith, Tucker, when he was fighting Holmes, Spinks, Frank Bruno maybe, that sort of era. He peaked very, very, very young. All-time great resume, top 15, maybe top 10 depending on what kind of mood we're in. Not the very, very top of all time. Head to head, definitely in the conversation, and on his day, a very, very, very tough man to beat. Arguably he never actually lost on his day, and by the time the Buster Douglas fight happened in 1990, the writing was already on the wall due to issues outside of the ring. Tyson's style was just not going to suit someone who wasn't training as hard as he needed to be and wasn't dedicated to his conditioning as much as he's been early on in his career. How would he do against the current heavyweights? Looking at Tyson, clearly the biggest cause for concern will be his size in the modern era. And I think if you add his size to the fact that he may have had some difficulties in certain fights where the opponents were able to use lateral movement and keep distance against him, I do think it's hard to think he'd make as easy work of the current crop of heavyweight champions as he made of the crop of heavyweight champions in the mid to late 80s. A guy like Tyson Fury would have such a significant size advantage, height and weight, and distance, reach, range over Tyson, that Tyson would really have to go some to get the victory. Tyson, you wouldn't rule out of any fight whatsoever. But I, for one, think that Tyson Fury's movement, and I think Vladimir Klitschko is another one I'd throw into the mix. The fact that they could move, the fact that they could try and keep fighters at range, I think that would cause real problems. If Mike Tyson were to get into range, Tyson Fury is the only one I'd really give too much chance of surviving. But it was possible to keep Tyson off and to fight a mobile fight about Tyson. Don't rely on the highlight videos. Don't watch a clip of knockouts and think that it was impossible. If you look at some of his other fights, the James Tillis fight being the one I've referred to several times in this video, you can see that it wouldn't be impossible for a guy like the Tyson Fury to beat Vladimir Klitschko to pit rounds up against Tyson. Maybe sacrilege to say that. I know a lot of the hardcore boxing fans put the fighters of days gone by on an absolute pedestal, and you cannot question them. But the facts are that Mike Tyson was a 5'10" heavyweight who weighed in at 210 pounds and who was kept at distance at times in his career. And when he was kept at distance, for me, he was a less effective fighter. Guys like AJ, guys like Wilder, I still think stylistically they match up very well for a peak Mike Tyson. I don't believe they've got the movement, the smoothness, the jab to keep them off him. Clearly, those guys have huge size advantages over Tyson. Clearly, they're big hitters, but Tyson's one of the biggest hitters in heavyweight history. Tyson's relentless. Tyson's hard to catch because he's so low. He's coming in at strange angles. He's coming in with such explosion. And I just believe that those guys have not had the tests in their professional career where they're given work on the inside, where they're caught to the body. I don't believe that they'd be able to nullify the ferocity of a guy like Pete Mike Tyson. That's my take on this. Let me know your thoughts. These videos are never going to please everyone. You know, there's going to be people very, very upset with the content. As I said at the start of the video, this is slightly new territory for me. This is not a topic that I've covered in depth before. I don't consider myself a boxing historian. I've had to rewatch a lot of these tapes. These are fights that I wasn't alive for when they were happening. So just one man's opinion, someone who considers themselves an armchair fan rather than a historian or an expert. But I thought it was an interesting topic to discuss. Let me know your comments in the section below. Let me know your thoughts on this content. Did you enjoy the video? Am I right? Am I wrong? Did I misspeak at any time? Let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up button. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And just like Faraz did, please check out my Patreon page where you can support the channel and potentially we can discuss other projects like this and review videos. Many thanks indeed for tuning in, people. Appreciate you watching my channel.